is Julia Balderas, and I'm here today to talk to you about an influential study done by Rosenhan. He titled his study, Being Sane in Insane Places. So before I get into the study, I would like to give a little bit of background. Rosenhan was intrigued by the anti-psychiatry movement, and this movement began in the 60s, and these people believed that psychiatric treatment is actually more harmful than helpful, and that the diagnostic process is highly subjective. To be clear, Rosenhan was not part of this movement, but he was intrigued with their ideas, and it did inspire him to conduct this study. So the reason for Rosenhan's study was he was interested in determining how valid psychiatric diagnoses were. He wanted to see if the sane could be distinguished from the insane, and were categorizations of mental illness harmful or helpful. He also wanted to know if the characteristics of psychiatric illnesses were just in the minds of the observers, or were they actually being displayed by the observed. So Rosenhan didn't put forth one clear hypothesis. Instead, he proposed two possible outcomes. The first is if normal people were admitted to the psychiatric hospital and discovered to be sane, it would be clear that the sane can be distinguished from the insane, no matter the context or the environment. On the other hand, of course, if normal people are admitted and they are not detected as sane, it is very problematic, and it brings into question the validity of psychiatric diagnoses. So the method of the original study was 8 people, including Rosenhan, were admitted to 12 different psychiatric hospitals. They first called the hospitals to make an appointment, and when they reached the admissions office, they complained about hearing voices saying the words hollow, thud, and empty. No other symptoms were presented at this time, and all relevant facts about the pseudo-patients were kept the same. After the admission, the pseudo-patients no longer showed symptoms. When the pseudo-patients were asked by the staff how they felt, they indicated that they felt fine and they were no longer feeling symptoms. Additionally, pseudo-patients were tasked with writing notes in a notebook detailing their observations of the ward. And each pseudo-patient knew that they were responsible for having themselves discharged from the hospital. No one was coming to rescue them. So they had every inclination to show themselves as sane. So the results of the original study were all pseudo-patients but one were diagnosed with schizophrenia and admitted. When they were discharged with a diagnosis of schizophrenia and remission. Once they were labeled schizophrenic, this label stuck with staff despite all evidence to prove that the pseudo-patients were sane. What's interesting to note, however, is that only the staff were fooled by the pseudo-patients. Other patients knew that the pseudo-patients were sane. They made comments such as, "You're not crazy, you're a reporter, you're a journalist." So it is interesting to note that only the staff were fooled. Even evidence that a pseudo-patient was sane and not who they said they were explained away. A good example of this was the pseudo-patient's note-taking. It was explained away as just a part of their pathological behavior. So the ultimate result of this study was that psychiatric hospitals cannot distinguish between the sane and insane. So as can be imagined, once the study was published, the results were very shocking. And one teaching hospital actually doubted the validity of the study. So Rosenhan decided to conduct a second part of the study where he told that hospital that within 3 months he would send pseudo-patients and they would have to identify them. However, no pseudo-patients were sent. So the results of this second part of the original study were that out of the 193 patients who were admitted to the hospital, 41 were deemed to be pseudo-patients with high confidence, and 23 were considered suspect. Now remember, Rosenhan never sent pseudo-patients to that hospital. So what this showed was that the tendency to diagnose someone as insane can be reversed. When Rosenhan discussed the results of his study, he described the stickiness of psychodiagnostic labels. Once the pseudo-patients were diagnosed as schizophrenia, there was nothing that they could do to overcome that label, and all their subsequent behaviors and characteristics were all colored by that label. Another alarming discovery was the degree of depersonalization and hopelessness that was felt by the pseudo-patients and the patients. On the next slide, you're going to be watching a video that will discuss the relevance of this study.
Well, there are problems with the diagnostic manuals used in psychiatry. The ICD and of course the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, both of these manuals have come under serious critical scrutiny in recent years for wrongly medicalizing everyday experience. They've done this in two ways. Firstly, by inflating the number of mental disorders believed to exist from around 106 disorders in the 1950s to around 370 today, if you include the appendix inclusions and the subdivisions. Secondly, they have done this by progressively lowering the bar for what constitutes mental illness. These two strategies have led to a scenario in which more and more of our natural and normal, albeit painful, human experiences are being wrongly reclassified as indicating psychiatric conditions. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that the more people who are being wrongly medicalized, the more will suffer from the stigma of being labeled mentally ill unnecessarily, the more will be prescribed powerful psychotropic drugs unnecessarily, the efficacy and safety of which is still not guaranteed. And finally, the fewer will be offered non-medical alternatives.
The first modern study that I found was conducted in 1992 by G. Langweiler and M. Linden. One pseudo-patient presented herself to 4 different physicians with 4 different backgrounds. Great care was taken by that pseudo-patient to keep all symptoms, characteristics, and behaviors the same between physician to physician. All 4 physicians came up with 4 different diagnoses and 4 different treatments. So what this highlighted was the phenomenon of interphysician variability. And despite the use of standard categorization, bias, experience, and subjectivity occurs during diagnosis. The second modern study that I found was also conducted in 1992 by A. Conning and L.A. Rowland. This study examined how staff attitudes determine the assessment of the patient's needs as well as the intervention. So staff who rated high on client orientation spent more time on assessing their patient's needs and more time on determining their intervention. However, those who scored higher on management orientation spent less time on assessing the needs of their patients and less time on determining their intervention. In order to provide proper individualized care, great care needs to be put into assessing the patient's needs as well as preparing the intervention. So what this study showed is that this process is individualized and subjective. Both studies show that what Rosenhan discovered was still relevant today. The validity of psychiatric diagnoses are still called into question and can be demonstrated in these studies. Langweiler and Linden show that diagnoses are subject to bias, experience, and subjectivity. And Conning and Rowling showed that it depends on the attitude of the staff on how each approaches diagnosis and intervention. I thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.